The summer I turned 24, the fog came in off the Sacramento River earlier than usual. By 7 in the morning it had already swallowed the back fence, the Meyer lemon tree my mother planted the year I was born, and the shed where my father kept his tools in alphabetical order by function. I used to think that was a quirk. Standing at the kitchen window that August, watching the white press itself flat against the glass, I understood it for what it was, a man who needed to control the arrangement of everything within his reach. My name is Wren Calloway. I was 23 years, 11 months, and 18 days old the morning I made the decision that would define the next 6 months of my life. I know the exact count because I had written it on the inside cover of the composition notebook I kept in the locked drawer of my desk, the one piece of furniture in my childhood bedroom with a key, which I wore on a thin chain under my shirt from the day I turned 18. 18 days before my 24th birthday. 18 days before the lease I had signed in secret was set to begin. I want to tell you what my father was like before I tell you what he did, because I think it matters. He wasn't a man who shouted in public. He wasn't a man who broke things or left marks. Wade Calloway was 6 feet of measured calm, a contractor who had built half the remodels in our neighborhood and who sat in the front pew at church with his hands folded in his lap and his face arranged into an expression of quiet decency. People trusted him. Clients handed him checks before the work was done because he looked like the kind of man who wouldn't run. He had a voice like gravel settling, low, even, certain. When he used it on me, it didn't sound like cruelty. It sounded like fact. That was the part that was hardest to name when I was young. Cruelty with volume is easy to point to. Cruelty that arrives in a reasonable register, that wears the clothes of concern and practicality, that sits across the dinner table and passes the biscuits while it's doing what it's doing. That kind is harder. You spend years wondering if you imagined it. I hadn't imagined it. My mother, Laurette, had left when I was 9. Not dramatically, she didn't take me with her, didn't fight for custody, didn't make a scene at the door. She folded herself out of our lives the way a person folds a letter back into an envelope, slowly and with care, and then she was gone. My father explained it to me that same night in terms I was too young to fully parse. She had chosen a different path, he said. She hadn't been able to handle the responsibilities of a family. He said it with his hands folded on the kitchen table, his voice steady, his eyes on mine. I nodded. I believed him for years. My brother, Colton, was 2 years older than me and had taken our father's shape in almost every way that mattered. Same jaw, same deliberate walk, same tendency to speak in declarations rather than questions. Colton worked for our father's contracting company and lived 20 minutes away in a house our father had helped him purchase, a fact our father referenced whenever Colton's loyalty seemed to waver, which wasn't often. Colton was good at loyalty. He had refined it into something almost devotional. Then there was our Aunt Delia, our father's sister, who came to Sunday dinners and holiday gatherings and who had the particular talent of being present without ever quite taking a side. She was a small woman with careful hands and a habit of setting things down slowly, as though she were always a little afraid of the surface beneath. She had looked at me across tables my entire childhood with an expression I couldn't fully read. Something between apology and instruction. I hadn't known until recently which one it was meant to be. The three of them, my father, Colton, Aunt Delia, formed the complete architecture of my family. There was no one else to name. I had been saving money since I was 16. Not from some grand plan at the start. I'd gotten a job at a grocery store 3 blocks from school because I wanted a pair of boots I'd seen in a window, and the boots cost $62, and my father had looked at the price tag and said that $62 was a lesson in wanting things you didn't need. So I got the job. I bought the boots. I wore them until the soles separated from the uppers, and by then I had understood something about the particular freedom of money that belonged only to me. I kept a savings account at a credit union on the far side of Sacramento, not the bank my father used, not the institution where he held the joint account he'd opened in my name when I was 12. That joint account had always bothered me in a way I couldn't articulate until I was older. The card came in my name. The statements came to our house. My father handled them. I had asked him once at 16 if I could have access to the online portal, and he had looked at me the way he looked at a door that was slightly ajar and said, "You don't need to worry about that, Wren. I've got it handled." I had not asked again. The credit union account was mine alone. I had opened it with the boot money more or less, and over 7 years I had built it into something I was quietly proud of. I had worked summers and weekends and every holiday shift I could get. I'd moved from the grocery store to a bookkeeping job at a small logistics firm downtown, which paid better and turned out to be something I was good at, the kind of good that surprised me. That felt like finding a room in a house you'd lived in for years. I had a head for numbers. I had a head for the way money flowed and accumulated and could, if you treated it carefully, grow without making noise. By the August of my 24th year, my credit union account held $41,000. I also had a Roth IRA I'd opened at 21, a money market account I'd started at 22, and a small brokerage account I'd funded through a workplace program at the logistics firm. I had never told my father about any of them. I had never told Colton. When my father asked about my finances, and he asked every few months in that measured way of his, I described the grocery store savings and a vague notion of a small fund I was building, and I watched his face settle into the expression of a man who believes he knows the full shape of a room. He did not know the full shape of the room. The lease was for a one-bedroom apartment in Midtown Sacramento, on a street lined with old oaks that dropped their acorns in September like small useful warnings. I had viewed it twice, once alone on a Tuesday afternoon, once with my friend Blythe, who had an eye for the things that matter in an apartment: water pressure, light angles, whether the kitchen smelled like the previous tenant's cooking or like something older and structural. Blythe had approved it. I had signed. The lease started September 1st. That gave me 26 days from the signing to the move. I had told no one in my family. I want to explain why, because the secrecy wasn't theater. It wasn't drama. It was calculation, and it was correct. My father had opinions about my moving out that he had shared with me over the preceding 2 years in the incremental way he shared opinions that mattered to him, not all at once, not in a confrontation, but in small installments dropped into ordinary conversation. You're not ready for that kind of expense, Ren. You don't have the cushion for something to go wrong. Rents are brutal right now. You'd be throwing money at a landlord instead of building real equity. Each statement delivered in a tone of pure financial pragmatism, as though he were a disinterested advisor rather than a man who had collected my rent-free presence in his house for 6 years past the age when I'd needed to be there. I had thought at first that his reluctance was ordinary parental concern. I had revised that conclusion slowly, over months, as I paid attention to the things he actually did rather than the things he said. He had mentioned twice that my savings would be safer in a consolidated account. His word, consolidated. As though my money were a stray animal that needed to be corralled. He had asked me once to add him as a beneficiary on any investment accounts I held. I had said I'd look into it. I had not looked into it. He had brought up 3 times in the past year a financial arrangement he described as a family trust, something informal, nothing legal, just a structure, he said, that would protect us all if something happened to anyone. Colton had nodded through all 3 conversations. Aunt Delia had set down her fork each time and looked at her plate. I had nodded too. I had said each time that I'd think about it. What I had actually been doing each time was noting the pattern. The dinner invitation came on a Wednesday. A text from my father, which was unusual. He preferred phone calls, that said, "Family dinner Sunday. Delia's coming. Be here at 6. No ask." A statement. I confirmed I'd be there because not confirming would have raised questions I didn't want to answer yet. I spent Thursday and Friday quietly. I went to work. I ate lunch at my desk and ran numbers on the logistics firm's quarterly reconciliation and let the ordinary texture of the week carry me. On Saturday, I drove to the credit union and sat in the parking lot for 11 minutes before I went inside. The woman at the desk was named Francine. I had dealt with Francine before. She was efficient in a way that felt like kindness, which is a rarer combination than people think. I told her what I needed. She pulled up my accounts without any expression beyond professional attention. We discussed the options. I asked 2 questions. She answered both. I signed 3 forms and received 3 confirmation documents, which I folded and placed in the interior pocket of my jacket. I was in the building for 22 minutes. When I came out, the sun was hitting the parking lot asphalt at a low angle and the heat came up off it in visible waves, and I stood beside my car for a moment with my hand on the door handle and felt something I couldn't name precisely. Not relief, not quite, but the specific physical sensation of a door closing behind you, the latch catching, the sound of something becoming settled. I drove home. I filed the confirmation documents in the locked drawer. I put the key back on the chain around my neck. Sunday came. My father cooked brisket for Sunday dinner, which he only did for occasions he considered significant. The brisket was good. He was a better cook than I had ever told him, partly because I understood early that complimenting him on something was a form of currency he kept, and the kitchen smelled of it when I came through the door at 5:50, early enough to demonstrate that I'd taken the invitation seriously. Colton was already there, sitting at the kitchen island with a beer, his elbows on the counter in the posture of a man who belongs completely to the room he's in. He nodded when I came in. I nodded back. We had the relationship of two people who share a language without quite sharing a vocabulary. We could communicate the necessities without ever getting close to anything that mattered. Aunt Delia arrived at 6 exactly. She came through the door carrying a dish of something covered in foil and kissed my father on the cheek and set the dish on the counter with that careful, deliberate motion I'd watched her use my entire life. When she turned and saw me, she held my gaze for a half-second longer than usual. I filed that away. We sat down to dinner at 6:15. My father said grace. He always said grace, with his eyes closed and his hands flat on the table rather than folded, which I had always found an odd variation from the convention. Then he served the brisket and passed the sides, and the conversation moved through the ordinary channels. Colton's current project, a kitchen remodel in Elk Grove, a neighbor's fence dispute my father had been consulted on, the heat. The ordinary architecture of a Calloway family dinner. I ate. I kept my voice easy when I spoke. I watched my father. He was waiting for something. I had known that from the text. There was a specific quality to his patience, the way a man who has decided what he's going to say holds himself in the minutes before he says it, a kind of interior stillness that reads, if you don't know him, like simple contentment. I knew him. The brisket plates were cleared. My father brought out a dish of peach cobbler Delia had made, that was what was under the foil, and set it in the center of the table. He served everyone. He poured himself more iced tea. Then he set the pitcher down and his hands settled on the table in that flat, deliberate way, and he looked at me. "Ren," he said. "We wanted to talk to you about something." The we registered. I kept my face neutral. "I've been thinking," he said, "about your situation. The move you've been considering." A pause. "Your finances." I said, "All right." "You're 24 in a few weeks," he said. "And Sacramento's not the same city it was when you were in school. Rents are," he made a small gesture with one hand, "they're not reasonable. And a young woman on a bookkeeper's salary, without family close by, without a real cushion, that's a vulnerable position, Ren. I don't think you've fully sat with what that means." Colton had his arms crossed on the table. He wasn't looking at me, he was looking at the cobbler in front of him with the expression of a man who has already decided to agree with whatever is said. Aunt Delia's fork was in her hand. Then it wasn't. She set it down on the edge of her plate without sound and looked at the tablecloth. "What I'd like to propose," my father said, his voice carrying that particular evenness, the register that had always meant, "This is already decided, I'm presenting it as a question as a courtesy, is that while you're in this transition period before you're settled, before you know what your expenses are actually going to look like, we hold your savings for you. As a family. For safekeeping." He said that word the way he said most important words, without emphasis, as though emphasis would be vulgar. Safekeeping. I looked at him. "Colton and I have talked about it," he said. "It's not complicated. You'd transfer your accounts, whatever you've got in savings, your IRA, whatever the firm set you up with, into a family account temporarily. Until you're on your feet. Then we return it. All of it." He paused. "I've had a form drawn up. Simple. 1 page. He reached beside his chair. He brought up a manila folder. He opened it on the table, slid a single sheet of paper across to me with 2 fingers and left it there. I looked at it once. The form had my name at the top, printed, not handwritten. Below it, a transfer authorization for all accounts held in my name, accounts listed by type, not number, because he didn't know the numbers, I realized, which meant he'd had someone draft this generically. There was a line for my signature at the bottom. There was a notary block. There were 2 witness lines already filled, Wade Calloway and Colton Calloway. I looked at the form. I looked at the notary block. I counted the pause instead of answering it. My father watched me read it. His face was what it always was, reasonable, patient, certain. "Take your time," he said. The peach cobbler was still steaming faintly in the center of the table. Outside, the Sacramento evening was doing what Sacramento evenings do in August. the light flattening, the air going amber and thick, the city settling into the slow particular heat of a valley at dusk. Somewhere outside, a car door shut. A dog barked once, then stopped. I was still looking at the form when Aunt Delia's hand moved. A small motion, she picked up her glass of iced tea and set it back down, and the small sound of glass on wood was the only thing in the room besides my father's waiting. The form was 1 page. My entire savings were named on it in general terms. My father had 2 witnesses ready. He had a notary block. He had prepared this before he sent the text on Wednesday. I hadn't moved yet. My hands were in my lap, out of sight below the table. My voice, when I decided to use it, would stay steady. I knew that. What I hadn't decided yet, what I was still in the middle of deciding, with the form an inch from my right hand and my father's eyes on my face, was exactly how much of what I knew I was going to let him see tonight. I had learned somewhere in my early 20s that the most useful thing a person could do in a room that was pressuring them was to take up exactly the right amount of space, not to shrink, which invited more pressure, and not to expand dramatically, which invited escalation, but to simply remain the exact size you were and wait. It was a skill I had practiced in smaller moments, a manager who talked over me in a meeting, a friend who borrowed money and then pretended she hadn't. You held your size. You waited. The other person always moved first. My father was not a man who moved first easily. I knew that too. It's straightforward, he said, after the silence had stretched to a length he found uncomfortable. I'm not asking for anything unreasonable. I can see that, I said. Colton shifted in his chair. He still wasn't looking at me. He had a habit, in these kinds of conversations, of removing himself from them visually while remaining present, a technique I'd always found interesting, the way it let him be a witness without being accountable for witnessing. The timing is what concerns me, my father continued. He leaned forward slightly, his forearms coming to the table, his hands still flat. You've got a lease you're considering. You're talking about first month, last month, deposit, that's 3 months of rent in one payment. Then movers. Then furnishing a place from scratch. You've seen what furniture costs. You've seen what groceries cost when you're buying for one. He paused, letting the arithmetic sit there. You'll burn through more than you think in the first 60 days. And if something goes wrong, a car repair, a medical bill, you're left with nothing backing you. Every word of this was reasonable. That was what he did. He wrapped the thing he was actually doing inside a layer of things that were genuinely true, so that disagreeing with the thing he was doing required you to also disagree with the true things, and that made you sound unreasonable. I appreciate the thought, I said. I want you to do more than appreciate it, he said, and there was something in his voice then, the first small shift in register, a fraction of warmth replaced by something harder. Not a crack. Not yet. Just a shift. I want you to take it seriously. I want you to consider that you're 23 years old. 24 in 18 days, I said. He looked at me. A beat. 24 in 18 days, he said, correcting himself without apology. And you have built up some savings, which I'm proud of, Ren. I want to be clear about that. You've been responsible, but responsible savings and knowing how to manage a household budget on your own are different things. You've never done this before. I've been managing the household budget here for 2 years, I said. That landed. I watched it land. He absorbed it without expression, which was its own kind of expression. That's different, he said. How? I asked. There was a pause. Not a long one. Because the house is mine, he said. I nodded. I let that sit. I picked up my glass of iced tea and drank from it and set it back down, and I felt in my hands the specific steadiness that had gotten me through everything I needed to get through in the past 6 months. The lease signing, the account meetings, the afternoons I'd sat in parking lots and in my locked bedroom with the composition notebook and the careful arithmetic of my own future. Aunt Delia was very still. Wade, she said. She said it quietly. It was the first word she had spoken since Grace. My father looked at her with an expression that was almost curiosity, the way he looked at things that had spoken out of turn. He didn't say anything. I think, Delia said, and then she stopped, and the stop lasted long enough that I looked at her. She was looking at the tablecloth again. I think Ren should probably have some time to look at that form. That's what I'm offering her, my father said. I mean privately, Delia said. Not at the dinner table. The silence after that was a different texture than the previous silences. It had weight to it, the weight of something that had been held back for long enough that its release changed the air in the room. My father looked at his sister for 3 full seconds. Then he looked back at me. "Of course," he said. The register was back to even. "Take it home. Read it over. If you have questions, you can call me." He reached across and tapped the form with one finger, a light tap, almost gentle, and then retracted his hand. "I'd like an answer by end of week." "End of week. Not whenever you're ready. Not no rush. End of week." I looked at the form. I picked it up. I folded it once along the middle and I held it in my hand and I looked at my father across the table and I said, "I'll read it." He nodded. He picked up his fork and took a bite of peach cobbler and the conversation shifted. Colton said something about the Elk Grove project, about a tile decision that had gotten complicated, and my father responded with the full weight of his attention, and the dinner table became, for a few minutes, a dinner table again. But Aunt Delia didn't pick her fork back up. She sat with her hands in her lap and once, just once, she looked at me across the table and the expression on her face was clearer than it had ever been in 23 years of dinners. It was an apology. It was instruction. I held the folded form in my lap below the table and I thought about the 3 confirmation documents in the locked drawer in my room, and I thought about Francine at the credit union with her efficient, kind competence, and I thought about the 22 minutes I had spent in that building on Saturday morning, and I thought about the key on the chain around my neck, which was pressing very slightly against my sternum. My father was waiting for an answer by end of week. He had 2 witnesses already signed. He had a notary block prepared. He did not know that every account named on that form had been closed on Saturday morning at 10:14 a.m. He did not know what I knew. And sitting at that dinner table with the peach cobbler going cold in the heat of the August evening, I understood that I was going to have to decide carefully and soon how long to let that remain true, because the form in my lap was not a proposal. It was a test of whether I understood what he was doing, and my father, I had learned, did not ask for things twice. If I handed back a signed form, the money would move and it would not come back. If I refused without explanation, he would find another angle. The dinner ended at 8. My father walked me to the door. He always walked guests to the door, a courtesy he extended even to his children, and he put a hand briefly on my shoulder and said, "Think it through, Wren. I just want you taken care of." His hand was warm. His voice was even. He smelled like the cedar soap he'd used my entire life. I said, "I know, Dad." I got in my car. I sat in the driveway for a moment with my hands on the wheel, looking at the house through the windshield, the lights in the kitchen window, my father's silhouette as he moved back toward the table, Colton's truck in the driveway, the Meyer lemon tree at the corner of the house, its fruit still green in August, weeks away from turning. The folded form was on the passenger seat. I hadn't told him yet. I wasn't going to tell him tonight. But end of week was Thursday and I had a locked drawer and 3 confirmation documents and 18 days, and my father had just shown me, with a prepared form and a notary block in my brother's pre-signed witness line, exactly how long he had been planning this. The question I was sitting with, the one that followed me out of the driveway and onto the dark Sacramento streets, was not whether I was going to fight him. That had been decided on Saturday, in a credit union parking lot at 10:14 in the morning. The question was what fighting him was actually going to cost. I drove home through the Sacramento streets with the windows down because the air conditioning in my car had been slowly failing since June and I had been postponing the repair, a decision that had made sense financially at the time and that I was reconsidering at 9 o'clock on an August evening when the city was still holding the day's heat the way a stone holds warmth after the sun has moved off it. Sacramento in August has a particular quality, a weight that doesn't lift after dark, a thickness in the air that makes the night feel like a continuation of the day rather than a relief from it. I drove through Midtown, past the street where my apartment would be in 18 days, and I did not slow down. I didn't let myself look at it the way I wanted to. That felt like something that belonged to a version of me who was further along in this than I currently was. At home I went straight upstairs. I heard the television in the living room, either Colton had come back before me or he had never left, and I climbed the stairs without announcing myself and went to my room and locked the door and stood in the dark for a moment before I turned on the lamp. The room settled around the light. My desk, my bookshelf, the narrow closet, the single window that looked out over the backyard where the Meyer lemon tree was a dim shape in the dark. Everything in its place. Everything the same as it had been that morning. The folded form went into the locked drawer. I did not read it again. I had read it once at the table, which had been enough. I knew what was on it, I knew what it was reaching for, and reading it a second time would only be a way of giving it more space inside my head than it had earned. I locked the drawer, put the key back on the chain, and sat on the edge of my bed with my hands between my knees and let the room be quiet around me. Outside, the neighbor's sprinkler system clicked on. The sound was very ordinary and very distant. I did not sleep well. I had not slept well in several weeks. I had decided to call that pragmatism rather than anxiety, because pragmatism was something you could work with. Monday passed. Tuesday passed. I went to work and reconciled accounts and ate lunch at my desk and answered emails with the particular focused calm that numbers always made available to me. The logistics firm occupied the second floor of a low building on L Street, and my desk faced a window that looked out over a parking structure, which was not a beautiful view but which had the advantage of giving me something neutral to rest my eyes on when I needed to think. I spent a lot of Tuesday looking at that parking structure. My coworker Blythe Okafor sat 2 desks from mine. We had been friends for 3 years in the way that people who work in close quarters and share a sensibility become friends. Not loudly, not through any single event, but through accumulation, through the gradual recognition that the other person's instincts could be trusted. Blythe had helped me find the apartment. She had an eye for the things that mattered in a space and the things that didn't, and she had walked through the Midtown unit with me on a Saturday afternoon and opened every cabinet and turned on every tap and stood in the kitchen for a long moment before saying, simply yes. That had been enough. She handed me a coffee on Tuesday morning without comment. I thanked her. She went back to her desk. That was, in that moment, exactly the right amount of human contact. On Wednesday evening my father called. I was in the kitchen making dinner when my phone lit up on the counter. I looked at it. I let it ring through. I finished what I was making and ate it and then listened to the message, which was what I had known it would be, measured, patient, reasonable. Just checking in. Wanted to see if you'd had a chance to look at the form. No pressure, Ren, I know it's a lot to take in. Call me when you get a chance. No pressure. He said it without irony, without any apparent awareness of the form's notary block and the 2 pre-signed witness lines. I set the phone face down on the counter and washed my bowl and stood at the sink looking at the dark window above it for a moment. I did not call back. Thursday morning brought Colton. He was standing in the parking lot of the logistics firm when I pulled in at 8:15, beside his truck, arms crossed, sunglasses on, weight distributed in the posture of a man who has been waiting long enough to have opinions about it. I parked and got out and he straightened off the truck and nodded at me. Hey, he said. Hey, I said. I kept my voice easy. Something wrong? Dad asked me to check in, he said. I looked at him for a moment. The morning sun was already hard overhead, the way Sacramento sun is in August, not gradual, just present like a fact. Colton's face was mostly hidden behind the sunglasses, but I knew the set of his jaw, had known it my whole life. He called me Wednesday night, I said. I'm going to call him back. He's asking about the form, Colton said. He said end of week. Today is Thursday, I said. Ren. He unfolded his arms. He put one hand on the roof of his truck briefly and then took it off, a gesture that had no clear destination. He's trying to help you. He's worried about you going out there without a real cushion. I know you don't always see it that way, but he's our dad and he's been thinking about this for a while. That last phrase landed and I let it land. He's been thinking about this for a while. Colton had not meant to say it the way it sounded. He was not a careful speaker, not about things he believed he didn't need to be careful about. I know he has, I said. Something crossed Colton's face, a brief, uncertain adjustment, the look of a man who has heard a tone he wasn't expecting and doesn't know what to do with it. He had come here with a script and I wasn't following it. He stood there for a beat, then got in his truck without another word. I stood in the parking lot watching the morning heat lift off the asphalt in thin, slow waves. The glare off the roof of Colton's truck had been sharp enough that I'd had to angle away from it slightly when he put his hand up there, and now with the truck gone the space it had occupied was just empty lot, just the ordinary Sacramento morning going about its business. Colton had pulled out of the lot with the same deliberate, unhurried motion he used for everything, the motion of a man who has decided something and doesn't need you to see the decision being made. I stood there until the sound of his engine faded into the ordinary noise of the street, and I thought about the notary block and the 2 pre-signed witness lines and the text that had said be here at 6 rather than would you like to come for dinner, and I thought about the phrase he's been thinking about this for a while, which was the most honest thing Colton had said to me in years without meaning to. Then I went inside, took the elevator to the 2nd floor, sat down at my desk, opened the quarterly reconciliation file, and put my hands on the keyboard. The numbers in front of me were the kind that made sense, organized, accountable, traceable to a source. I let them take up the space in my head that Colton's visit had disturbed. I didn't fill the silence of the rest of the morning with anything that wasn't work. It was that afternoon, Thursday, 3:17 by the clock in the corner of my monitor, that something shook loose in my thinking that I had been circling for 2 days without quite looking at directly. The form. The notary block. The 2 pre-signed witness lines, Colton's signature already there, my father's already there, before I had ever been asked to sign anything. I had been holding that as evidence of premeditation, which it was, but I hadn't yet followed the premeditation back to its starting point. My father had planned this far enough in advance to have a document drafted, to have Colton sign it, to prepare a notary block. That kind of preparation had a lead time. It didn't happen in a week. It happened in the kind of sustained, quiet deliberation that my father was extremely good at, which meant it had probably been in development for months, possibly longer. The question that followed from that was, what had he seen or learned or decided that had put the plan in motion? I went home that evening. I unlocked the desk drawer. I did not take out the form. What I reached past it and took out was a manila envelope I had placed there 8 months earlier and had not opened since. I set it on the desk in front of me, a thing I had been waiting to be ready for, and now I was. I pressed the metal clasp open. I reached in and took out the contents. 12 pages of account statements, rubber-banded, printed on a Thursday morning in December from a public library printer 2 blocks from the office, paid for with quarters from my coat pocket because I hadn't wanted to print them anywhere connected to my name. Statements from the joint account, the one my father had opened in my name when I was 12, with $500 he had called birthday money, the start of a real savings habit. My name on it as primary holder. His name as joint holder with full access. No card issued to me. No portal access. When I had asked at 16, he had said, "You don't need to worry about that, Ren. I've got it handled." I spread the 12 pages across the desk in order and went through them the way I went through the firm's reconciliation files, methodically, line by line, looking for the shape. The account had grown. Not from anything I recognized as my own activity, no deposits in my name, no paycheck routing, nothing that mapped to my employment history. The growth came from transfers. Irregular transfers, varying in amount, arriving at intervals that followed no pattern I could immediately name. $240 in one March. $800 in a November 3 years later. A $1,400 deposit in August, my birthday month, labeled Callaway Contracting Transfer. A series of smaller amounts in the $300 to $600 range arriving across 4 years with no label beyond transfer, INT. I opened the composition notebook to a clean page and wrote down every transfer. Date, amount, source label where one existed. It took 20 minutes to work through all 12 pages carefully enough that I was certain I hadn't missed anything. Then I totaled the column. $22,460 in transfers over the life of the account. Current balance, $412. I sat with that for a moment. The sprinkler next door was running again. A car went by outside slow, the bass from its speakers arriving before it did and leaving after it had gone. 22,000 in. 400 remaining. I had not spent it. I had never touched it. I had never had access to it. The money had come in and the money had gone somewhere, and neither the arrival nor the departure had ever been explained to me. I put the statements back in the envelope back in the drawer. I closed the drawer and held the key in my fist for a moment, pressing the teeth of it against my palm, feeling the small specific pressure of it, which was useful in the way that concrete physical sensation is useful when your mind is moving faster than the room can hold. And now a form on that same desk, requesting that I transfer $41,000 in savings, plus an IRA, plus a money market account, plus a brokerage into a new joint account. For safekeeping. With a notary block and 2 pre-signed witnesses and an end-of-week deadline. The outline of the thing was becoming clearer. I didn't yet have all of it. I didn't know where the 22,000 had gone or why the transfers had arrived the way they had. But the outline was enough to know that the Saturday conversation, the one where he showed me everything and I understood, was designed to explain away what I'd found before I could finish finding it. I called him on Friday morning. I sat in my car in the driveway with the engine off and the heat already building and dialed his number. He picked up on the second ring. "Ren," he said. His name for me as greeting, as small assertion that he had been expecting me. "I got your message," I said. "And I got Colton yesterday." A brief pause. He was just checking in. "I know," I said. "I've been thinking about the form." "Good." That single syllable carried a specific quality, a settling, a relaxation, the sound of a man who has heard what he expected to hear. He thought my tone meant compliance. I let him think it for 3 more seconds. "I have questions first," I said. "Of course," he said. "What questions?" "The joint account," I said. "The one from when I was 12. I've been looking at the transfer history." The pause that followed was different in texture from any pause in our conversation so far. Not the pause of a man gathering a response, my father was extremely good at those, but the pause of a man who has registered that the floor is different than he believed it to be. 3 seconds. With my father, 3 seconds was a significant duration. "What about it?" he said. His voice had not changed register. That was the thing about him, even wrong-footed, he held the voice. But I had been listening to that voice for 23 years, and I could hear beneath the evenness the specific quality of a man recalibrating. "There were over $22,000 in transfers across 11 years, I said. "From Callaway Contracting mostly. The current balance is $400. I'd like to understand what those transfers were." A slow breath. Controlled. The breath of a man deciding which version to begin with. "Those transfers were for you," he said, his voice warming slightly, a deliberate adjustment. "I was building something for you. The way I always said I was." "The balance is $400, I said. "Because expenses came up," he snapped, and the register cracked, not a shout, but a clean fracture along a line that had always been there. He pulled it back within 2 seconds. "Because running a business means cash flow decisions that a bookkeeper on a salary doesn't always have visibility into." My voice stayed steady. "I'd like to understand the specifics," I said. "This is not a phone conversation," he said. "Come to the house Saturday. I'll show you the books, you'll understand the full picture. Bring the form and we'll go through everything together." I said I would be there Saturday. I ended the call and sat in the driveway with the phone in my lap, looking at the back of the garage door, the paint peeling at the lower corner, the shallow dent from 5 years ago that my father had never repaired. Small evidence of imprecision from a man who presented himself as precise in everything. What I had were 4 months of statements. For the full picture, the real picture, the one my father was planning to manage in person, I needed all 11 years. The bank held that history. I was the primary account holder. I was entitled to it. I drove to work. At 11:15 I told Blythe I had a personal errand at lunch. She nodded without looking up. I drove to the bank and stood at the customer service desk and explained what I needed, and the woman looked at my ID and looked at the screen and said the full 11-year history would need to come from records not in the immediate system, and it would take until end of business. I said I would wait. She told me to come back at 4:30. I went back to work. At 4:38 she brought out a sealed envelope and set it on the counter in front of me. 61 pages. I drove home with the envelope on the passenger seat. At home I changed out of my work clothes, made tea, sat at the desk with the lamp on. Then I opened the envelope, reached in and took out 61 pages, put them in order and started at the beginning. The transfers labeled Callaway Contracting Transfer were the ones I had expected to find. What I had not expected were the entries on pages 9 through 14 that carried a different label entirely, not the contracting company, not INT, not any abbreviation I recognized from the 4 months of statements I'd already reviewed. These entries were labeled Estate/Lorette, and they were, in the years they appeared, the largest single deposits in the account's history. Lorette was my mother's name. The first one arrived in the 3rd year after she left. I would have been 12. The amount was $4,200. The second came 14 months later, $3,800. The third 2 years after that was $6,000 exactly. There were 4 total, spread across 8 years, stopping when I was 19. The combined total was $18,040. My mother had been sending money into an account in my name for 8 years after she left. I read each entry 3 times. I cross-checked the dates against what I remembered of my childhood, the years, the seasons, the approximate shape of each period. I had been 12 for the first one, 13 for the second, 15 and 19 for the remaining 2. During all 4 of those years, my father had managed that account. During all 4 of those years, I had not known the account existed in any meaningful way. During all 4 of those years, my father had told me, in the incremental matter-of-fact way he told me things he did not want questioned, that my mother had chosen a different path. That her absence was a choice she had made and continued to make. He had never mentioned money. $18,040. Gone like the rest of the $22,000. Present on the statement, absent from the balance. I sat at the desk for a long time without moving. The lamp made a warm circle on the pages. I was aware of my own breathing in the way you become aware of it when something has shifted the coordinates of a room, the lamp, the pages, the breath, the key against my sternum. My mother had not entirely left. She had sent money into an account I didn't know I had access to, managed by my father, that had held money for me for 8 years before it disappeared into whatever the transfers had fed. I added the 4 entries to the composition notebook. I wrote estate/Lorette at the top of the column and underlined it twice. Then I turned back to the statements and kept reading, because there were 47 pages left, and page 14 had only been the beginning. By page 23 I had stopped taking notes in the composition notebook and started making marks directly on the statements, small check marks in the margin beside entries that needed a second look, a bracket around anything that repeated a pattern I'd already seen. It was the method I used at work when a reconciliation file had more wrong with it than a clean column could capture. You stopped trying to summarize and started marking the evidence where it lived. The 47 remaining pages took me 2.5 hours. My tea went cold and I didn't replace it. Somewhere around page 38 the neighbor's dog started barking at something and then stopped, and I registered the sound and then released it without looking up from the statements. What I found, spread across 61 pages and 11 years, was this. The estate/Lorette deposits, 4 of them, totaling $18,040, were the clearest entries in the entire record. They arrived at irregular intervals in varying amounts, labeled in a way that was specific enough to suggest my mother had structured the transfers herself, through whatever legal mechanism the word estate implied. They stopped when I was 19. I didn't know what had stopped them. I didn't know if she had stopped sending or if something else had changed. The Callaway contracting transfer entries were murkier. They were more numerous, 11 of them over 9 years, and the amounts varied in a way that didn't follow any pattern I could identify as salary, bonus, or routine business payment. Some were small, $200, $350. Some were substantial, $2,400 once in October of the year I turned 17. The labeling suggested they came from my father's business, but whether they represented money he was genuinely setting aside for me, money passing through my account for some other purpose, or something in between, the statements alone couldn't tell me. I needed the contracting company's books for that, which was precisely what my father had offered to show me on Saturday, which was precisely why I was not going to walk into that room without knowing everything else first. The third category was the one I hadn't anticipated and couldn't fully explain. 7 entries, small, spread across the middle years of the account's history, labeled only with a number string and the word REIMB. Reimbursement. For what, from whom, the statements didn't say. The amounts ranged from $80 to $420. They arrived in no pattern. They were the entries I marked with 2 check marks instead of 1, because I didn't know what they were and I didn't know if not knowing mattered. I put the 61 pages back in order. I rubber banded them. I put them in the manila envelope with the original 12. I put the envelope in the locked drawer and locked it and sat back in my chair and looked at the ceiling of my bedroom. My father wanted me at his kitchen table on Saturday morning with a form I was supposed to sign. My mother, whose absence had been described to me my entire life as a choice she had made freely and continued to make, had been sending money into an account in my name for 8 years. Money that was gone. I was going to that table. I had always been going to that table. The question of whether I was going had never been the real question. The real question was what I was going to say when I got there, and how much of what I knew I was going to let him see at once, and whether I was going to let him finish his explanation before I said any of it. I decided, sitting in that chair at 11:40 on a Friday night, that I was going to let him finish. I was going to let him build the whole structure of his explanation and lay it out on the table between us, and then I was going to show him what I had. Not all of it at once. That was important. You didn't show everything at once. You showed the first layer and you watched what he did with it, and then you showed the next. I set my alarm for 7. I turned off the lamp. I did not sleep well, but I slept. Saturday arrived gray and cool, which was unusual for Sacramento in August. A marine layer had pushed in overnight from the coast, the kind that sometimes stalled over the valley for a day and sometimes burned off by 10. I drove to my father's house through streets that were still quiet, the city not yet fully awake, the oaks throwing no shadows because there was no sun to cast them. I had the manila envelope on the passenger seat. I had the composition notebook in my bag. I had not brought the form. My father opened the door before I knocked, which meant he had been watching for my car. He was dressed, pressed shirt, the khakis he wore on weekends when he expected to be seen, and he had coffee ready, 2 mugs on the kitchen table, which was a domestic courtesy that I recognized as also being a staging choice. The table was set for a conversation. His chair at the head. A chair to his left for me, positioned so that the morning light, dim as it was, would be at his back and in my face. I sat where he'd placed me. I put my bag on the floor beside the chair. I accepted the coffee because refusing it would have been a signal I wasn't ready to send yet. "I'm glad you came," he said. He sat down across from me, or rather at the head of the table, which was not across from me but slightly above me in the spatial grammar of the room. He folded his hands on the table. "You said you'd show me the books," I said. "I will," he said. "But I want to talk first. I want you to understand the context before you look at numbers, because numbers without context just create more questions." I said, "All right." He talked for 12 minutes. I know it was 12 because I was watching the clock on the microwave above the stove, not obviously, just in the way you track time when time is one of the things you're managing. He talked about the contracting business, about the years it had been lean and the years it had been good, about cash flow in construction being nothing like cash flow in other industries, about the decisions he'd made to move money where it needed to go when it needed to go there. He talked about setting things aside for me. He talked about college. About the years he'd considered starting a fund for my education, about how those plans had shifted when I hadn't gone to a 4-year school. He talked about the informal family trust he'd mentioned at dinners, about how it wasn't unusual or complicated, about how families structured things this way all the time. He said, "Everything I did was for this family." He said it once in the middle of the 12 minutes and I noted it and let him continue. When he finished, he unfolded his hands and looked at me with the expression of a man who has explained something completely and is waiting for the explanation to land. "I want to ask you about the estate/Lorette entries," I said. The expression didn't change. The hands, folded again now on the table, did not move. But something behind his eyes did, a slight shifting, the way a thing shifts when it is heavier than the surface it's sitting on. "What entries?" he said. I opened my bag. I reached in and took out the manila envelope. I set it on the table and opened it and drew out the 61 pages and found page 9 and set it in front of him. He looked at it. He did not pick it up. "There are 4 of them," I said. "The first one arrived when I was 12. 3 years after Mom left. $4,200. They continued until I was 19. $18,040 total." I kept my voice level. "I'd like to understand what those are." My father looked at the statement for a long time. Then he sat back in his chair. He picked up his coffee mug, drank from it, set it down. "Your mother," he said, "made some financial arrangements before she left. It was part of how we settled things between us. She put money into that account periodically as part of that settlement." "As part of a legal settlement?" I said. "An informal arrangement," he said. "Nothing filed. We agreed between us." "And the money is gone," I said. "It was used," he said. "For the household. For your expenses. For the years I was raising you on a contractor's income when the business wasn't where it is now." I looked at him. "You used money my mother sent for me," I said, "for household expenses." "I raised you on my own," he said, and his voice dropped to a register I recognized, lower, heavier, the voice he used when he wanted the weight of what he was saying to be felt as a physical thing. "I paid for your food, your clothes, your school, your car insurance, every doctor's appointment, every trip you ever took. Your mother wrote 4 checks over 8 years and thought that settled her debt. It didn't settle anything. That money went toward what it cost to raise you, which is exactly what it should have gone toward. I looked at the statement on the table between us. I looked at my father's face. Did you tell her you were using it for that? I said. A pause. She didn't ask. Did she know I never received it? I said. Did she think I knew she was sending it? His jaw tightened. 1 degree. I don't know what your mother thought, he said. We didn't have that kind of communication. She sent $18,000, I said. Over 8 years. Into an account in my name. Did you ever tell me she was sending it? You were a child, he said. And then you were a teenager. What was I supposed to say? Your mother is sending guilt money and I'm depositing it into the account I'm going to use to keep the lights on. You didn't need that information. I'm 23, I said. I needed that information. You need it now because you've decided to need it, he snapped, and his voice rose a half register before he brought it back down. He pressed his hands flat on the table, a familiar gesture, the hands flat, the pressure visible through the whitening of his knuckles. You've decided that this family has wronged you somehow. You've decided that everything I've done for 23 years was some kind of scheme against you, and so you've gone looking for evidence to fit that story, and you've found some numbers on a bank statement and you think you understand what happened here. I let him finish. I counted the beat that followed. What did happen here? I said. What happened here, he said, his voice dropping back to the low, heavy register, is that I kept this family together for 23 years without any help from the person who should have been here doing it with me. What happened is that I made decisions under pressure, financial decisions, the kind you make when you're running a business and raising a child and keeping a household going on margins that don't leave room for a savings account with a name on it. What happened is that I am trying right now to make sure that you don't walk out of this house and into an apartment you can't afford and spend the next 2 years draining the savings you've worked for because you're too proud to accept help when it's offered. He stopped. He looked at me directly. Everything I did was for this family. Everything. And if you can't see that, I don't know what else I can say to you. There it was, the same phrase, the same construction. The second time. I set it down in the part of my mind I was keeping for exactly this. I want to ask about the form, I said. He exhaled. A controlled exhale, the kind that stands in for a more visible frustration. The form is straightforward. You had Colton sign it before you asked me, I said. Because Colton is a witness, he said. That's a logistical step, Ren, not a conspiracy. You had it notarized before you asked me, I said. The notary block is prepared, he said. We still need the notary present to execute it. That happens when you sign it, which requires you to agree to sign it, which requires this conversation, which is why we're having it. He was calm again. The register had resettled. He was back in his element, the reasonable explanation, the step-by-step dismantling of concern, the voice that made disagreement feel like irrationality. What accounts does it cover? I said. Whatever savings you have, he said. We transfer it temporarily, you get established in your apartment, you have a cushion you know is safe, and when you're stable we return it. It lists my IRA, I said. He paused. Yes. An IRA has early withdrawal penalties, I said. Moving it out of my name before I'm 59 and a half triggers a 10% federal penalty plus income tax on the distribution. If you transferred my IRA into a joint account under your name, I would lose a significant portion of it immediately. A silence. Not a comfortable one. There are ways to structure that transfer, he said, that minimize the... There aren't, I said. Not for an early IRA liquidation. I work in financial reconciliation. I know what the structure options are. His jaw moved. He was looking at me with an expression I had never quite seen on his face before, not anger, not the controlled frustration I was accustomed to. Something adjacent to reassessment. The look of a man encountering a room he thought he had mapped and finding a wall where there wasn't supposed to be one. I'm trying to protect you, he said. I know you are, I said. You are 23 years old, he said, and you think you understand everything and you don't. You don't understand what it costs to maintain a life out there without a net. You don't understand what happens when something goes wrong and there's no one behind you. I have been the person behind you your entire life and you are sitting at this table treating me like I'm someone you need to defend yourself against. He stopped. He looked at the statement on the table between us, at the page I had set in front of him with the estate/Lorette entries marked. He looked at it for a moment, and then he looked back at me. "I want you to sign the form," he said. "I want you to do it today. I want you to give me until September to get you properly situated, and then every dollar comes back to you, and you move into your apartment in October with a real foundation instead of whatever patchwork you've been building in secret." He knew about the lease. The word October, not September, not the 1st of next month, told me he knew about the lease or had guessed at it or had found it. I filed that and kept my face where I needed it. "The form covers all of my accounts," I said. "Yes," he said. "Including the ones at the credit union," he said. I looked at him. My voice stayed steady. My hands in my lap were still. "Bring the form tomorrow," he said. "Sleep on it tonight. I'm not asking for anything unreasonable. Everything I did was for this family, Ren, and you are this family. You are the reason I did any of it." There it was, the third time now, the same words, the same shape. This time it was the closing argument, the sentence he returned to when everything else had been laid out and he needed the room to feel settled. The way he said it, "You are this family, you are the reason," was the specific, practiced warmth of a man who had learned that the last thing he said in a conversation was the thing most likely to be carried out of it. He was watching me. Waiting. The coffee in my mug had gone cold. The marine layer was still holding outside, the kitchen window showing a gray-white morning with no shadows in it. Somewhere in my bag below the table was a composition notebook with a column of numbers and 4 entries labeled estate/Lorette, and a separate note I had written at 11:40 the night before that said, "Show the first layer. Watch what he does. Then the next." I looked at my father across the kitchen table. I had not shown him the first layer yet. I had shown him the statement. I had asked the questions. He had answered them in the way he answered things, reasonably, sequentially, with the full weight of his voice behind them. He did not know about Saturday morning at 10:14. He did not know what Francine at the credit union had confirmed in 22 minutes. He did not know that the accounts listed on his form had been closed before he'd sat down at the Sunday dinner table and asked me to sign it. He was looking at me and waiting for my response, and I was looking at him, and the kitchen was quiet, and I was about to say something that was going to change the shape of this conversation permanently. "The accounts at the credit union are closed," I said. I said it the way I said most things that mattered, plainly, without emphasis, the way you state a fact that doesn't need decoration because the fact itself is sufficient. I watched my father's face while I said it. I had been waiting, without fully admitting it to myself, to see what his face did when he heard it. I had imagined several versions. What actually happened was quieter than any of them. He went still. Not the controlled stillness he used in ordinary conversation, the practiced, deliberate calm of a man who had made a discipline of his own composure. This was a different quality of stillness. The stillness of a mechanism that has received a signal it was not built to process. His hands were flat on the table. His eyes were on mine. For 3 seconds, he said nothing at all. Then, "What did you say?" It was not a question. The inflection was flat, the 4 words arriving as a single unit, a statement in question's clothing. "I closed the accounts at the credit union," I said. "The savings account, the money market, and the brokerage. I closed them on Saturday morning. Before the dinner." He looked at me. Something moved through his face, not the cracking I had heard in his voice on the phone, not the snap of the earlier exchange, but something slower and more structural. The expression of a man watching the floor shift beneath furniture he thought was bolted down. "The IRA," he said, "is in the process of being transferred to a new custodian," I said. "In my name only." That transfer was initiated Saturday as well. The kitchen was very quiet. The marine layer outside had not burned off. The gray morning light sat flat against the window above the sink, even sourceless, the kind of light that makes everything in a room look like it has been there for a long time and will be there for longer. My father took his hands off the table and put them in his lap. He looked at the estate/Lorette statement still on the table between us, the page I had set in front of him an hour ago. He looked at it for a moment the way a person looks at an object after the context around it has changed, seeing it differently not because the object has changed but because the room has. "You did this before Sunday," he said. "Yes," I said. "Before I showed you the form." "Yes." He looked up. "How long have you been planning this?" I considered the question. "Since I understood what you were planning," I said. His jaw moved. A slow, controlled motion. And how long is that? Long enough, I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said in the lowest register of his voice, the one that sat beneath reasonable, beneath patient, in the place where the real weight of him lived, "You went behind my back." "I managed my own accounts," I said. "You went behind my back," he said again, and this time there was something in it that I recognized from childhood, not volume, never volume, but a kind of compressed force, the specific pressure of a man who is accustomed to being the one who acts while others respond. He had always been the one who acted. I had just shown him that the sequence had changed. I reached into my bag. I took out the composition notebook, opened it to the page with the transfer totals, and set it on the table beside the bank statement. He looked at the notebook. He looked at the columns I had written, dates, amounts, source labels, the estate/Lorette entries listed separately and underlined. He did not pick it up. "I want to understand the full picture," I said. "You offered that. I'm here to get it." He looked at the notebook. Then he stood up. He went to the counter, poured himself more coffee, stood at the counter with his back to me for a moment. When he turned around his face had resettled, not all the way, not back to the composed certainty of the man who had opened the door an hour ago, but part way. Enough to continue. "You're making a mistake," he said. "You think you've protected yourself and what you've actually done is cut yourself off from the people who would have helped you when you needed it." I said, "I'd still like to understand the transfers." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he pulled out the chair at the head of the table and sat back down. He put his hands flat on the table. He said, "What do you want to know?" "Everything," I said. "Starting with where the $18,000 went." He talked for 20 minutes. I let him talk. I didn't interrupt, didn't fill the spaces he left, just let each explanation come and settle, and then asked the next question when he finished. He was a good explainer, organized, sequential, with the contractor's habit of breaking a complicated thing into components and presenting each component as though it were load-bearing and therefore beyond question. The $18,000 from my mother had gone, he said, into the household over the course of the years it arrived. Groceries, utilities, the roof repair in the year I was 15, the transmission in the car he'd bought me at 17. He itemized it the way he itemized a project estimate, specific, plausible, delivered in a tone that made each line feel like a settled fact. I listened. I asked 3 clarifying questions. I wrote nothing in the notebook. When he finished I said, "I want to ask about the REIM entries." He paused. "The what?" I turned the 61-page bank history to the pages I had marked and set them in front of him one at a time. Pages 9, 11, 14, 17, 22, 26, 31. 7 pages, each with a checkmark in my handwriting beside one entry. He looked at the pages. He looked at the first one for a long moment, then the second. "Those are reimbursements," he said. "For what?" I said. He was quiet. He picked up the third page, page 14, and held it. "For expenses advanced on your behalf," he said. "By whom?" I said. He set the page down. He aligned it with the others, a small, precise motion, the habit of a man who straightens things when he needs a moment. "By your mother," he said. I looked at him. "Mom was reimbursed," I said, "for expenses she advanced on my behalf." "Certain expenses," he said. "Through my account," I said. "The account was in your name," he said. "The money was designated for you. When she advanced costs and needed to be made whole, the reimbursement came from there." I looked at the 7 marked pages on the table between us. I looked at the amounts, $80, $120, $240, $310, $420. Small amounts, irregular intervals. The shape of something recurring without being regular. Something ongoing. "She was paying for expenses related to me," I said, "after she left." "Certain expenses," he said again. "What expenses?" I said. His jaw tightened. 1 degree, the same degree it had tightened twice before. "Medical expenses," he said. "When you were sick. When the coverage we had didn't cover everything. She contributed. And she was reimbursed." I looked at him. I thought about being sick as a child. I thought about the 2 hospital stays, one at 9, one at 13, and the orthodontist at 11, and the specialist my father had never named when I'd asked, who I'd seen twice at 14 for something he'd described as a routine follow-up. I thought about my mother, who had not been there, and about the money she had sent, and about the reimbursements that had come from her contributions to an account I didn't know existed. She had been paying for my medical care. From a distance. Without me knowing. Without me knowing. Did she know I was sick? I said. He looked at me. Something moved behind his eyes, a careful interior motion. She was informed, he said. When it was necessary. You told her I was sick, I said. She was told what she needed to know, he said. And she sent money for the medical bills, I said. Into the account in my name. And you used the account to reimburse her. That's correct, he said. And I didn't know any of this was happening, I said. He said nothing. He picked up his coffee mug and set it back down without drinking. He looked at the window above the sink, at the gray marine layer morning pressing itself flat against the glass. A muscle along his jaw worked once, twice, and then stilled. Did she ever ask to speak with me? I said. When you called to tell her I was sick? The silence that followed was the longest of the morning. I don't know what your mother's expectations were, he said. His voice had gone carefully neutral, not the warmth of the explanation, not the weight of the closing argument. Just flat. The voice of a man who has run out of the version of events he had prepared. But she asked, I said. And you told her something? He looked at me. He did not confirm or deny it. I picked up the bank history pages and I stacked them carefully and I put them back in the manila envelope. I did not look at my father while I did this. I looked at the pages, at the edges of them, at the process of organizing them, because I needed a moment and the pages gave me one. I need to speak with my mother, I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I don't know where she is. I looked at him. My voice stayed level. I think you do, I said. He looked back at me. He did not confirm or deny it. He picked up his coffee mug and set it down without drinking from it and looked out the window at the gray morning. I drove home. I sat in my car in the driveway for a while before I went inside. The marine layer had not burned off. The morning was the same gray it had been when I'd arrived, even sourceless, the kind of Sacramento August day that arrived without permission and stayed without apology. I sat with my hands in my lap and looked at the garage door and thought about the 7 Riem entries and the medical bills my mother had paid from a distance and the question my father had not answered. But she asked, and you told her something. He had not denied it. That was the thing I was sitting with. In 23 years of conversations, my father had never left a denial on the table if one was available to him. He had explanations for everything, organized, sequential, delivered in the voice of a man who found your confusion understandable, but ultimately a product of incomplete information. The one thing he had not done in all those conversations was stay silent when silence was the only honest answer. And he had stayed silent this morning. Twice. I went inside. I climbed the stairs. I went to the locked drawer. I moved the manila envelope and the composition notebook to the side, and underneath them, beneath the form my father had given me at Sunday's dinner, which I had not looked at again since I'd locked it away, was an envelope I had put there 6 weeks earlier, after it arrived in the P.O. box among the bank statements. A different envelope. Personal-sized, ivory-colored, the kind that comes from a stationery set rather than an office supply drawer. It had a Portland return address in handwriting I didn't recognize, and my name on the front in the same handwriting, and no explanation for how whoever had sent it had known about the P.O. box. I had opened it once 6 weeks ago, read the single page inside, and put it back. I had not been ready for what it contained, and I had put it away in the manner of someone filing a thing in a place where it could wait. I pressed the metal clasp open. I reached in and took out the single page, unfolding it slowly along the crease from 6 weeks ago. I laid it flat on the desk in the lamp's circle of light. It was a letter. Handwritten, 2 paragraphs, dated May of this year. It began, Ren, I don't know if this reaches you or if you'll want it to have. I've tried to send things to the account your father manages and I've never heard back, not once in 11 years, and I've had to assume either that you received it and didn't want to respond, or that it never got to you at all. I'm writing to this address because a mutual contact told me you had a box. I don't know if that's true. If it is, I'd like to talk if you're willing. The second paragraph gave a phone number. A Portland area code. It said, I know what your father has told you about why I left. I think you should know there's another version. I had read this 6 weeks ago. I had folded it back up and put it away because 6 weeks ago I had been in the middle of closing accounts and signing a lease, and I had not had the room to hold one more piece of what my family was. I had room now. I took out my phone. I looked at the number on the letter. I looked at it for a long moment, the way you look at a door before you open it, taking in the shape of it, the fact of it, the understanding that what's on the other side will be what it is regardless of how long you stand here. I dialed. It rang twice. Then a woman's voice, cautious, a little rough, the voice of someone who had spent the last 6 weeks preparing for this call to come and still wasn't fully ready. "Hello," she said. "It's Ren," I said. A silence. A breath. Then, "I wasn't sure you'd call." "I almost didn't," I said. "I need to ask you some things." "I know," she said. "I'll tell you whatever I can." We talked for 47 minutes. I sat at my desk with the letter laid flat in front of me and the composition notebook open to a clean page, and I asked questions and she answered them. But it wasn't the clean back and forth of a deposition, the way I'd half imagined it might be. It was more halting than that. She stopped herself sometimes mid-sentence, not to evade but to find the right word, the precise one, the one that was accurate rather than just convenient. There were moments where I asked something and she went quiet for 3 or 4 seconds before answering, and I recognized that quality of pause. The pause of a person who has been telling themselves a version of a story for a long time and is deciding, in real time, to tell the truer one instead. I asked about the letters first. She had written to me, she said. Not occasionally, consistently at every birthday and at Christmas, and sometimes in between, for the first 7 years after she left. She had written to the house address because it was the only address she had. She had never received a response. After year 3 she had written to my father directly and asked whether I was receiving them, and he had written back, a single paragraph through his attorney at the time, saying that I had received the letters and that I had indicated I did not wish to respond, and that continuing to send correspondence was distressing to me, and he was asking her to stop. She had stopped. "I believed him," she said. "I know how that sounds. But I was very far away from the situation, and he had been the one telling me all along that you were adjusting well, that disrupting the stability he'd built would harm you more than absence would. And so when he said the letters were upsetting you, I thought," she stopped. Started again. "I thought that was my answer. That you had made your choice." "I was 9, I said. "I know," she said. Her voice carried something I couldn't name precisely, something between relief and sorrow and the particular weight of a thing that has been held for a very long time finally being set down. "I know you were 9. I should have fought harder." "You didn't know what you were up against," I said. "I knew enough," she said. "I didn't say anything to that. I let it sit." Then I asked about the money. She walked me through it methodically, the way someone walks through a thing they have gone over many times in their own mind. She had sent money, yes, the 4 estate/Lorette deposits I had found on the statements. The first one she'd sent because she had come into a small inheritance from her own mother's estate, and it had felt wrong to keep it without sending something to me. She had structured it through her attorney as a formal transfer into the account in my name, with documentation that specified the funds were intended for me directly. She had a copy of the transfer instructions. She had always had a copy. When she asked my father whether I'd received it, whether he'd told me, he had said yes. He had said I knew about it and had appreciated it. She had taken that at face value. "Did you ever try to contact me directly?" I said. "After the letters stopped?" She hesitated. "Once," she said. "I called the house phone when I thought you might be home alone." "I think you were 14. Someone answered, a young voice, and then the line went quiet for a moment and then your father came on. She paused. "He said you'd handed him the phone. That you didn't want to talk." I thought about being 14. I thought about the house phone in the kitchen, where my father spent most of his evenings. I thought about the fact that I had never, not once, received a call from a Portland area code. "I wasn't home," I said. She was quiet. "I had an after-school job at 14, I said. "At a hardware store 3 blocks from school. I was there every day until 5:30. Another silence. Longer. When she spoke again, her voice had a different quality, not the cautious roughness of the opening but something more open, the voice of a person who has just had a thing confirmed that they had not quite let themselves fully believe until this moment. "I should have called back," she said. "I should have kept calling." "Yes," I said. And then, because it was true and because she needed to hear it and because I was 23 and not 9 anymore, "But I understand why you didn't." I asked about the medical reimbursements last. The REIMB entries. She explained those carefully. My father had contacted her. Each time there was a gap in the coverage, a bill that exceeded what the insurance handled, and she had sent money for those too. Directly, at his request, into the account. Small amounts, the ones I had found on the statements. She had a record of each transfer. She had assumed the money was going toward the bills he'd described. Did he tell you I knew about it? I said. He said you were taken care of, she said. He said the family was managing fine. Did he let you speak to me? I said. When he called to tell you I was sick? The silence that followed was the longest of the call. He said you were resting, she said, finally. The first time. And the second time he said you were at school. You'd recovered. He said you'd asked about me. Her voice had gone careful and flat, the way a voice goes when a person is holding it together by choice. He said you'd asked if I was okay. I didn't know you'd called, I said. I know, she said. I know that now. I wrote 4 pages in the composition notebook. I wrote quickly, in the shorthand I used at work when I needed to get the shape of something down before I lost it. Abbreviated, connected by arrows, the relationships between things marked rather than spelled out. When we had finished talking, my mother said, "What are you going to do?" I looked at the 4 pages of notes. I looked at the letter laid flat on the desk. I looked at the manila envelope with the 61 bank statements inside it, and the locked drawer that held the form my father had given me at Sunday's dinner, and the key on the chain around my neck. I have a meeting with a lawyer on Monday, I said. A friend referred me. Estate and family law. Ren, my mother said. I should have fought harder. I told you, I said. You didn't know what you were up against. I knew enough, she said, the same words as before, and this time I heard the distinction. The first time had been about the custody arrangement, about the legal framework she hadn't pursued. This time it was about something older and simpler. She had known what kind of man she was dealing with. She had let him convince her that the kindest thing was to stay away. I didn't say anything to that either. I let it sit. Then I said, the lawyer's name is Gretchen Osei. She's in Sacramento. I'm going to bring the bank statements and the letter and the composition notebook. I'm going to show her all of it. All right, my mother said. And then, I said, I'm going to call Dad. She was quiet for a moment. What will you tell him? I looked at the form on the desk, the 1-page transfer authorization with the notary block and the 2 pre-signed witness lines. I thought about the kitchen table that morning and the gray marine layer light and my father's hands flat on the table and the 3 times he had used the same phrase. I'm going to tell him what I know, I said. And I'm going to give him the chance to tell me the rest before the lawyer does it instead. The meeting with Gretchen Osei was on Monday at 10 in the morning. She had an office on K Street, 4th floor, with a window that looked out over the downtown Sacramento grid, the buildings and the streets and the flat California light that had finally come back after the marine layer burned off on Sunday. She was a compact woman in her 50s with close-cropped gray hair and the particular professional stillness of someone who had spent decades listening to people explain complicated things and had learned to wait for the part that actually mattered. I spread the documents on her conference table. I put down the 61-page bank history first. Then I reached into the manila envelope and took out the original 12 pages. I unfolded the ivory letter from Portland and laid it flat beside the bank statements. I opened the composition notebook and set it to the page with the transfer totals, the estate/Lorette column with its underlined header, the REIM entries listed separately, the 4 pages of notes from the Saturday phone call with my mother. She looked at everything without touching it for a moment. Then she picked up page 9 of the bank history, the first estate/Lorette entry, and read it. She put it down. She picked up the letter from Portland. She read it twice. When did you receive this letter? She asked. 6 weeks ago, I said. And you've spoken with your mother directly? Saturday, I said. 47 minutes. She nodded. She picked up the composition notebook and looked at the 4 pages of notes from that call. She set it down and looked at the form, the transfer authorization which I had placed last in the center of the table. Your father prepared this before he presented it to you, she said. Yes, I said. And the accounts it references are already closed. Yes, I said. She looked at me with the expression of someone who has assessed something and is deciding how much of the assessment to offer immediately. The joint account is the primary issue, she said. If the transfers from your mother were received into an account in your name and used without your knowledge or consent, and particularly if there's any documentation of her intent, letters, any communication she kept from that period, there are grounds for a claim. She kept everything, I said. She said she kept everything. Gretchen Osei looked at the documents on her table. She looked at them the way I looked at a reconciliation file when the numbers had resolved into a shape I could work with, not with surprise, but with the specific, quiet attention of someone who knows what comes next. I'll need copies of all of this, she said. And I'll need your mother's contact information. And I need you to understand that what happens next is going to be a structured process. It won't be fast. I understand, I said. Your father is going to be informed, she said. Not today, not this week, but as part of the process. He'll be served with the initial inquiry. He'll know you've retained counsel. I know, I said. She looked at me. Are you prepared for that? I thought about the kitchen table. I thought about the gray morning light and the flat coffee and the form in the center of the table and my father's hands flat on the surface and the 3 times he had said everything I did was for this family and the way the 3rd time had been the closing argument, the sentence designed to walk out of the room in my pocket. I'm going to call him before you send anything, I said. I want him to hear it from me first. Gretchen Osei considered that. That's your choice to make, she said. I won't advise against it. I gathered the documents from the table. I put them back in the envelope. I stood up and put the envelope in my bag and shook Gretchen Osei's hand, and she held my hand for a moment before she released it and said, "You've done the hard work already. You came here with everything." I took the elevator down to the street. I stood on K Street in the Monday morning Sacramento light, the real light now, the summer light, the valley heat beginning to build under a clear sky, and I took out my phone and I called my father. He answered on the 2nd ring. "Ren," he said. "I need to tell you something," I said. "And I need you to let me finish before you say anything." A pause. "All right. I met with a family law attorney this morning," I said. "I've given her the 61-page bank history for the joint account. The full 11-year record. Including the estate/Lorette entries, and the Riem entries and the Callaway contracting transfers. I've also given her a letter from Mom and the notes from a conversation I had with Mom on Saturday." The silence on the other end of the line had a particular quality. Not the 3-second recalibration pause of Saturday morning, not the controlled breath of the Friday call. This was the silence of a man who has just seen the full shape of a room he thought he had built. "I spoke with Mom for 47 minutes, I said. "She told me about the letters you didn't pass on. The calls. The attorney she hired in year 3. All of it. Nothing from the other end. The lawyer's name is Gretchen Osei," I said. "She's on K Street. She's going to be in touch with you through formal channels, but I wanted you to hear it from me first, because you're my father and I thought you deserved that." I heard him breathe. Slow. Controlled. The breath of a man who is doing the only thing left available to him, which is to hold himself together while the room rearranges itself around him. "Everything I did," he said, and his voice was very quiet now, quieter than I had ever heard it, the register stripped of its weight, the certainty gone out of it, leaving something that sounded underneath like exhaustion, "was for this family." There it was. The same words in the same construction, but the 3rd time had a different quality than the first 2. The first time in the kitchen it had been a statement deployed mid-explanation to remind me who had sacrificed and who had benefited. The 2nd time at the table's close it had been the closing argument, warm, practiced, the phrase designed to walk out of the room in my pocket. This time it arrived the way a person says something they have said so many times it has become the thing they reach for when there is nothing else left to reach for. Not as argument. Not as closing statement. As reflex. "I know you believe that," I said. I did not say anything else. I let the line be quiet. I stood on K Street in the Sacramento light and I let my father sit with what he had just been told, and I held the phone and I waited. He didn't hang up. That was the first thing I noticed, that he stayed on the line breathing in the silence after I said "I know you believe that." I had expected the call to end. I had prepared myself for the click of disconnection, for the particular quality of an ended call that tells you the other person has decided the conversation is over. Instead I stood on K Street in the Monday morning light and held the phone and listened to my father not hang up. After a long moment he said, "Who referred you to this lawyer?" "A friend," I said. "Blythe," he said. I didn't confirm or deny it. It didn't matter. "You've been planning this for a long time," he said. Not an accusation this time. Something flatter. An observation like a man reading a measurement off a wall and accepting the number. I've been paying attention for a long time, I said. There's a difference. Another silence. Then, what does the lawyer want? That's a conversation for the formal process, I said. Gretchen will be in touch through proper channels. What I wanted was to tell you myself before that happened. As a courtesy, he said. As your daughter, I said. I heard something shift on the other end. A small sound, not a word, not quite a breath. Something in between. I had heard my father make that sound exactly once before, at his own father's funeral, standing at the graveside in the February cold with his hands at his sides and his face controlled, and that sound escaping him, just once before he closed it off. I had been 16. I had filed it away in the part of my memory reserved for the true things about people, the things they couldn't manage into a reasonable register. I need to think, he said. All right, I said. This isn't over, he said, and his voice had a different quality now, not the weight of the closing argument, not the certainty of a man presenting a settled case, but something more like a man standing in a room he doesn't recognize yet, trying to find the walls. I know, I said. It isn't over. That's why there's a lawyer. I ended the call. I put the phone in my pocket. I stood on K Street for another minute, looking at the Sacramento street in front of me, the buildings, the cars, the ordinary Monday morning texture of a city going about its business, and I felt something settle in my chest that I had not felt in months. Not resolution. Not relief exactly. Something more like the specific sensation of a thing that has been held under pressure finally being released into the air, where it could be seen and measured and dealt with in the light. I walked to my car. I drove to work. I was 20 minutes late and I sent Blythe a text that said tell you later, and she responded with a single period, which was Blythe's way of saying she understood and would wait. Gretchen Osei moved quickly once she had the full document package. Within 2 weeks she had sent a formal inquiry to my father's attorney. He retained one within 4 days of my call, which Gretchen told me was expected and in no way complicated the process. The inquiry covered 3 areas. The management of the joint account during my minority, specifically the disposition of funds sent by my mother, the informal financial arrangement that had substituted for any legal custody or support framework, and the question of what documentation existed for the contracting company transfers that had entered and exited the joint account across 11 years. My father's attorney responded. Gretchen responded to the response. I was not present for any of this, which was by design. Gretchen had been clear that my job at this stage was to let the process work and to be available when she needed me, not to manage the conversation myself. I was good at that. I had spent 23 years managing conversations with my father. I knew when to step back and let a structure do the work a structure was built to do. My mother sent the documents Gretchen requested. She had kept everything, the letters she had written to me over 11 years, bundled in rubber bands by year, in a box in a closet in her Portland apartment. She had kept the attorney's letters from year 3 and my father's attorney's responses, and the bank transfer confirmations for every deposit she had made into the joint account, and the reimbursement records. She had kept it all with the specific, careful attention of a person who knows, somewhere beneath conscious planning, that she might one day need to be able to prove what happened. When Gretchen called to tell me the documents had arrived from Portland, she said, "Your mother is thorough." "I'm glad," I said. "It helps significantly," Gretchen said. "What she sent corroborates the bank record on every point. The transfers, the amounts, the dates. And the letters," she paused. "The letters are substantial." I thought about the bundle of letters in a box in a Portland closet. Letters written to a daughter who had been told, year after year, in the even and reasonable voice of a man who arranged things the way he arranged his tools, that her mother had chosen a different path. "I'd like to read them at some point," I said. "That's between you and her," Gretchen said. "But yes. When you're ready." The process took 4 months. I moved into the Midtown apartment on September 1st as planned, the apartment with the old oaks on the street and the kitchen that smelled like clean plaster and the water pressure Blythe had approved. I moved in with the furniture I had and the savings I had kept and the morning light that came through the east window at 7 o'clock and made a long rectangle on the floor that I walked through every morning on my way to the kitchen, and I thought, every time, that this was what it felt like to be in a room that was entirely mine. Colton called once in September. He said Dad had told him some of what was happening and he wanted to understand it from my side. I told him I couldn't discuss the specifics while the formal process was active, but that I was willing to talk when it was finished. He was quiet for a moment and then said, "Did you know about Mom sending money?" I said yes. He said, "I didn't know." I said I believed him. He didn't say anything after that for a moment, and then he said, "Okay," and we ended the call. It was not a resolution. It was a door left ajar, which was more than I had expected from Colton and more than I had let myself plan for. Aunt Delia sent a card in October. A plain card, no occasion, with 2 sentences inside in her careful handwriting. I should have said something sooner. I'm glad you said it instead. I put the card on the windowsill in the apartment and looked at it sometimes in the mornings when I was drinking my coffee and the oak tree light was coming in off the street. The formal process concluded in November. I won't say it concluded cleanly because legal conclusions rarely are. There were negotiations, there were documents, there was a settlement framework that Gretchen walked me through over 2 long meetings at her K Street office. The second meeting ran nearly 3 hours. We sat across from each other at the conference table where I had first laid everything out in August, the city visible through the window behind her, and she walked me through the settlement line by line, explaining each component and what it represented and what I would be agreeing to. What emerged from the process was this: a formal acknowledgement that the joint account had been managed in a way that did not serve my interests as the named primary holder, a financial settlement that covered the verified amount of my mother's contributions, less a portion my father's attorney had negotiated against the household expense argument, and the formal dissolution of the joint account, which had a balance of $412, which my father transferred to me and which I deposited in my credit union account. At the end of the second meeting, when the papers were signed and the folders were closed and Gretchen was organizing the copies into the envelope that would go into her files on K Street, she looked up and said, "You came in here with everything you needed. That's not common." "I've been keeping records for a long time," I said. She smiled slightly, not a warm smile but a precise one, the smile of someone who recognizes a professional habit in another person. "Keep that habit," she said. I shook her hand. I took the elevator down to K Street. I sat in my car in the parking structure for a few minutes before I drove away. My father called in December. It was a Sunday evening, the kind of Sacramento December where the Tule fog settles into the valley in the late afternoon and turns the streetlights into soft orange columns and makes the city feel smaller and older than it is. I was in the apartment on the couch with a book I wasn't reading, and my phone lit up on the cushion beside me and showed his name, and I looked at it for 2 rings before I answered. "Ren," he said. "Dad," I said. He was quiet for a moment. I waited. Outside, the fog had thickened enough that the streetlight through the window was just a soft orange smear against the gray, and the oak branches I could usually see from the couch were invisible inside it. The apartment was warm. The Delia card was on the windowsill, where I'd moved it from the kitchen to catch the morning light, its edges slightly curled from the weeks it had been sitting there. "I want you to know," he said, "that I understand this is going to take time." "Yes," I said. "I'm not asking for anything," he said. I'm not calling to relitigate it. The process is concluded. I understand what was found and what was decided." A pause. "I want you to know that I don't regret keeping this family together. I made decisions I believed in. I still believe most of them were the right ones." Another pause, longer. "But I understand that some of them, that the account, that there are things I should have handled differently. Told you differently." I listened. I kept my voice level when I said, "I appreciate you saying that." "I'd like to see you," he said. "Not right away. Whenever you're ready. If you're ever ready." I thought about the kitchen table in August. The brisket and the peach cobbler and the form in the center of the table and the marine layer Saturday and the notary block and the 2 pre-signed witness lines. I thought about the ivory letter from Portland and the 47-minute phone call and the 4 pages of notes in the composition notebook. I thought about the estate/Lorette entries on page 9 of a 61-page bank statement and the bundle of letters in a box in a closet in Portland, kept through 11 years against the possibility that they might one day be needed. "I'm not ready yet," I said. "But I'm not saying never." He was quiet. Then, "That's more than he stopped. He started again, more carefully. "That's enough for now." "It's what I have," I said. We said goodbye. I put the phone down on the cushion and looked at the apartment around me. the east window light gone now to the fog's orange, the Delia card on the windowsill, the oak branches invisible in the gray outside, the warm lamp on the side table, the ordinary evening geography of a space that was mine. He had not said everything I did was for this family on that call. I had been paying attention and he hadn't said it. Whether that was because he understood now what the phrase had cost, or because he simply hadn't reached for it, I couldn't know. What I knew was that it had been absent, and that its absence felt like its own kind of information. Though he had said it one final time, not to me but to Gretchen's office, in a written statement his attorney submitted during the process, in the context of explaining his reasoning for the account management decisions. The exact phrase appeared in that document, in the formal and stilted language of a legal submission, and Gretchen had read it to me over the phone with her precise, neutral voice. All decisions regarding the account were made with the family's best interests as the guiding principle. Everything I did was for this family. There it was. In writing this time. The same words in the same construction in a legal document that now lived in Gretchen Osei's files on K Street, attached to a settlement that said otherwise. My mother came to Sacramento in January. She drove down from Portland in a car older than mine, and she called from the parking lot of my building because she didn't know if she should come up or wait, and I said come up and she did. She was smaller than I remembered and larger than the idea of her that I'd been carrying for 14 years. Both things true at once, the way things are when you've had a long time to construct an image and then the actual person walks through your door. We sat in the kitchen. I made coffee. She looked at the apartment the way people look at places they're seeing for the first time but have already tried to imagine, taking it in piece by piece, the east window and its January light, the bookshelves, the Delia card on the windowsill, the oak branches visible through the glass, bare in January, their structure clear against the pale sky. You made a good space, she said. I had help finding it, I said. We talked for 3 hours. We didn't talk about everything, there was too much for one afternoon, and we were both, I think, people who understood the value of pacing. We talked about Portland and what she had built there, the work she did, the neighborhood. We talked about the letters she had written, which she had brought photocopies of, the whole 11 years, bundled by year, in a manila folder she set on the kitchen table without pressure, just set down, available if I wanted them. I did want them. I reached across and picked up the folder and held it in both hands for a moment and then set it beside me on my chair, and she watched me do that and didn't say anything, which was the right thing. We talked about the money, briefly and practically, without emotion, the way you talk about a thing that has been formally resolved and doesn't need to be relitigated between two people who are trying to figure out what comes next. At one point she said, I should have fought harder. I said that on the phone and I meant it. I know you did, I said. I let him convince me that fighting would hurt you, she said. That it was better to stay away than to create conflict. He was very, she stopped. She looked at her coffee cup. He was very good at making things sound reasonable. I know, I said. I grew up in that. She looked at me. Something in her face settled, a tension releasing that had probably been there since she'd walked through the door. You figured it out, she said. I paid attention, I said. She nodded. She looked out the east window at the January Sacramento light, thin and pale, the oaks on the street bare and patient. We were not fixed. We were not the mother and daughter we would have been if 14 years had gone differently. We were two people at a kitchen table in a midtown apartment drinking coffee, beginning something that did not have a name yet and did not need one. That was enough for January. It was more than enough. I moved one more thing into the apartment that month. From the locked desk drawer in my old room, the room I had gone back to clear out after the settlement, with the key on the chain and the composition notebook and the manila envelope, I brought the envelope. All 61 pages of the bank history, and the original 12, and the ivory letter from Portland. I brought them to the apartment and I put them in a new manila envelope, a clean one, and I filed them in the small filing cabinet I'd bought for the second bedroom. I did not need them anymore in the active, urgent way I had needed them for those 6 months of August through November. They had done what they were built to do. But I kept them because I had learned that the value of a document is not always in its immediate use. Sometimes its value is simply in its existence, in the fact that it can be produced, that it sits in a drawer somewhere and says, this happened and there is proof and the proof has been kept. I kept the composition notebook too. I started a new one in February for work, reconciliation notes, a new system I was developing for the quarterly audit cycle. The old one I put in the drawer with the envelope. The 4 pages of notes from the Portland call, the transfer totals, the estate/Lorette column with its underlined header. Kept. Not because I planned to use them again. Because keeping things carefully was what I knew how to do, and because that habit, the habit Gretchen had told me to keep, the habit I had built in parking lots and library printers and locked drawers over 7 years, had turned out to be the truest thing about me. The lease on the Midtown apartment ran for 12 months. I renewed it in August for another year. I was there when the oaks dropped their acorns in September. I was there when the Thule fog came back in November and turned the streetlights orange and made the city feel small and ancient. I was there in January when my mother drove down again from Portland, and the second visit was easier than the first, the way second visits always are, and we sat in the kitchen again and the east window light came in at its angle and I made coffee and we talked, and it was something and it was ours. This story is a work of fiction, inspired by real emotional truths many families carry. If this reminded you of your own family, tell me where you're watching from, and subscribe for the next one.